Welcome to the Book Bungalow's virtual author event with Sharon Wright, author of The Mother of the Brontes. Here's the book. I can't get it all in the picture. I don't know. My name's Tanya Mills. I'm the owner and manager of the Book Bungalow in St. George, Utah. We're Southern Utah's only independent bookstore offering all new books and a full range of events. While we're open right now and taking precautions, we're doing our events virtually for now. Sharon's book is available for order from our store's website. You'll find the link in the chat box, along with a link for Sharon's website. And we'll be sure to include both of those links in our description when we post this recording on YouTube over the weekend. Those of you who registered will also receive the YouTube link as soon as the video posts. The Mother of the Brontes is a groundbreaking biography of Maria Brontë, revealing a remarkable woman who has spent 200 years in the shadow of her gifted children, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte. The Daily Telegraph called it a fine bit of detective work, giving it 5 stars. The Daily Express described it as beautifully researched and vibrantly written. And according to the Jane Austen Regency Review, the book is an exuberant, fast-paced, and deeply moving biography of a remarkable woman. Having read it myself, I would have to agree with all those assessments. Sharon Wright, who's joining us from her home in England, is an author, journalist, and playwright. She was born in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and now lives in southwest London with her family. She has worked as a writer, editor, and columnist for leading national magazines, newspapers, and websites. She's also written critically acclaimed plays, performed in Yorkshire and London. Her first book, Balloonamania Bells, was serialized in the Mail on Sunday and received widespread coverage, including on the BBC Woman's Hour and in the New York Post. We're extremely pleased to have her with us today. If you have any questions and you don't want to speak up, you can always put them in the chat room and I will speak them for you, but I've unmuted you also. If there's a pause, go ahead and speak up and ask your question. I want to begin actually because I want to ask a little bit about your plays, because I'm interested in theater myself. What topics do you take on in your plays? What are they historical plays? Are they contemporary?
I've only written 3, but that's something I'm really trying to return to. The first one was historical. It was the story of Lily Cove. It was sort of it's called Thriller. So it's a ghost story set in Haworth, where the Lady Aeronaut Lily Cove, who died there in 1906. It's a story I covered when I was a young reporter there, and then became the thing that set me on the trail of investigating the first women to fly, which became my first book. Then the very first one I wrote was about, hello.
Hi, Louise. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute. Because there's so few of us, if you want to unmute. Okay.
Yeah. So the very first play I ever wrote was about a slimming club, because I'm always on a diet. So that was quite
Slimming club.
Yeah, I know. So it was a little comedy, and it was called Full Fat. It was about women like me and my friends always trying to, get fit and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
That won a little local competition, which was nice. And then Thriller was fabulous. We did that up north, and we did it at Pondon Hall, which is beautiful. Sort of, it's run by my friends, but it's a beautiful hotel now on the tops outside Haworth, which has got lots of Bronte connections. But it was also where Lily Cove died, where she came to Earth, where she was found. So we did that as an immersive.
I don't know that story at all.
No, it's in my first book. So
well, I haven't read your first book yet. So
yeah.
That's the Balloonamania Bells.
Bells, yeah. So she was what set me off on writing nonfiction, actually. And then my last play was a comedy called Not Working. No, called The Social Not Work. And it was about, again, I wrote it about 2008 when I was made redundant. And it's about being made redundant in the crash. And then it's just a comedy about these women who try, but they're all like me, you know, they're all mums of a certain age, hopeless at social media, but they decide to try and get rich through social media. So it's just a comedy, really. It got very good reviews and we had a lot of fun with it, so it was nice.
Okay. All right. Well, let's begin in talking about Maria's the milieu that she was born into. Let's first, if you could talk about the moral standards of that day, because I learned a few things just in the first chapter that I hadn't known before.
Yeah.
So if you could talk about the moral standards and the kinds of circumstances she was born into and how marriage worked then.
Do you mean the fact her mother was pregnant when she got married?
Yeah. But that
is fascinating. Yeah. I'd like to know more about that myself, actually. And if we do go into future editions, I might sort of investigate that even more. But yes, I mean, marriage at the time, this was already dying out. But when her parents, Anne and Thomas, got married, marriage was deemed to begin in some places from betrothal. So, you know, it was very common to be pregnant by the time you actually got to the marriage ceremony. But that was respectable still. And I did read a figure that said about 40% of first pregnancies were before marriage in that sort of mid 18th century and earlier. So I mean, it's a very rural area, so these things probably did last. And I also think it was quite a practical thing, you know, to see if they were fertile as a couple often, really. But yeah, I mean, that she was pregnant when she got married was Anne Carn, who married Thomas Branwell. They were both from very big and well-regarded local families, and they became very influential in the Methodist movement. They were friends of John Wesley, and when he went to Penzance, he would stay with the larger family. As to the moral climate, I mean, like I say, they were part of that evangelical tradition, which was still within the Church of England at the time, but it was being led by John Wesley, who wanted to bring more of a sort of Bible-based religion back to a Church of England, which was seen as increasingly very sort of distant from its parishioners. You know, it was something for younger sons to take up and more preoccupied with their livings, I think, than their parishioners. So there was this great revival here, as elsewhere. And John Wesley, of course, went to America, didn't he? And did a lot of work there.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were a very respectable family. They were merchants, they were well off, they lived in the nicest street in Penzance, they were well heeled, they were well connected, and she was born into that. So she was born into a very sort of respectable, into the gentry. She was a gentlewoman, and she was raised as a gentlewoman.
And I've Sharon and I talked a little earlier, and I admitted to her my ignorance that the Pirates of Penzance, I didn't realize Penzance was in England.
I didn't know that.
This is the town that she grew up in.
Yeah, Penzance, yeah, exactly.
It's kind of a strange name, don't you? It doesn't sound very British.
Penzance, well, it sounds very Cornish. I mean, Cornish for...
Talk about the difference between Cornwall and the rest of England.
Well, Cornwall is on the very, very far southwest tip of England, so it's a peninsula, really. It's only got one border with the rest of England, and that's Devon, and we call it the West Country. So Cornwall has always had a very independent spirit. It had its own language, which I think, I'm not an expert in this, but I think it's enjoying a revival. But although it was seen by the rest of Britain as very remote and cut off, it was in fact, obviously, a very busy cosmopolitan port, and it was connected to the world by the sea. Very close links with France, America, you know, what they would have called then the colonies, which obviously is a very outmoded word now, but she would have been part of a very cosmopolitan community. You know, there were a lot of French emigres there because it was after the French Revolution. It was the heart of trade in that part of the world. So they had huge markets, and they were a coinage town. So tinners And the tin miners would have to bring their tin to Penzance and get it sort of deemed worthy for trade. So again, there was all this hustle and bustle, all the fish would come in. It was a very thriving, busy town. And Maria lived right in the heart of it. So
yeah,
it's a very interesting life she led. And of course, it was during the Enlightenment period. So, you know, there was the Penzance Ladies Book Club, which is the first one outside of London. And she would have been a member of that. That was more of it wasn't a book club like we'd think of it now. It was more of a sort of circulating library or a sort of a lending club. But it's certainly a focus for women.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Yeah. But first, the other thing I learned in chapter 1 was, and I'm surprised they didn't do, well, I guess here in the West, in America, they just developed cowboy boots and everybody wanted them. But the ladies of her day used pattens, which I hadn't heard of before. Maybe those of you who are more well-read with Jane Austen and stuff like that, know what they are. But they had the streets were not paved, and they would get really muddy, and they would get worse than muddy. A lot of refuse and stuff would go into the streets. And here are these ladies with their long dresses, and to cross the street or walk along, they needed something, and they developed what they called pattens. I'm going to show you a picture, okay? It's like a metal circular thing, and you stick your shoe in the top so that it's almost like a horse's hoof, it looks like. And the other one, this is more like what I think she wore. It gave you some height so that the mud did not get to your new shoes, you know?
Yeah, there were lots of different kinds. I mean, there were a version of clogs. I don't know if you know what clogs are. Do you have clogs there? Just wooden overshoes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there were all different kinds. The kind that Maria and her sister Elizabeth wore, we think, were more of a wooden overshoe. So you'd have your nice shoes, and then you'd have a wooden overshoe, and quite often raised off the ground on a hoop. And the idea was to just keep your nice shoes out of the mud, really. But it was particularly useful for the Bramwells of Chapel Street, because Chapel Street, apart from being the poshest street and the nicest street, it was also where, I think it was once a week, or it might be even once a day. It must have been once a week. 70 mules would come down from the tin mines to the ships and back and churn it up, you know, so they'd have this incredibly muddy street to negotiate to get anywhere, really. So the only reason we know anything about patterns is because Maria's sister Elizabeth, who became known as Aunt Branwell because she raised the Brontes after Maria died, it's referred to in Mrs. Gaskell's description of her, saying that she would clink up and down the stairs. Well, you were supposed to wear them outside. It was quite eccentric to wear them indoors. But the parsonage in Haworth used to have flagged floors. And it was cold enough for her, having come from subtropical Cornwall to wild and woolly Yorkshire. So she used to be known for wearing her patterns indoors. And it was a way that the young Brontes could hear that she was coming as well. Here comes that, clink, clink, clink.
Oh, here comes the aunt. Okay.
Yeah. I think they were already dying out as a fashionable thing to wear, even in their generation. But, you know, they were useful. And there's certainly a pair at the parsonage now in the collection, believed to have been Aunt Bramwell's.
Okay, the other thing that struck me as I was reading about this area where she grew up in the town and the occupations was the similarities with Poldark.
Yes.
And I want you to talk about those similarities and why.
Well, yes, because, I mean, Poldark was a series of novels, and they're set in exactly the era, in exactly the area where Maria was growing up. I mean, obviously it's fiction, but are you talking about the BBC? I mean, it was made into a series, I think, in the 70s, but very recently it's made into a very lush production. The BBC productions are amazing. So yeah, I mean, obviously it's fiction, but you get they're very well regarded novels for their veracity. So you get a very good feeling of what Cornwall in the late 18th and very, very early 19th century was like. And I always think it's really interesting that Poldark marries Demelza Khan. Well, Khan was Maria's mother's name. She was half Corn. So I think, I mean, what are the chances really? So, I mean, that was a very Cornish name, and huge Cornish networks that flow from that. But yeah, so if you've seen Poldark, I always think you've got a very interesting mental image. Obviously it's fiction, obviously it's televised, but
right.
the scenery at least is the same. You know, it's very beautiful as Cornwall, it's very wild. Mm-hmm. So all those lovely skies, lovely rugged coastlines, that's exactly what it would have been like for Maria. And she loved Penzance. She loved where she lived.
And her
she didn't realise she was never going home, did she?
Yeah. Her father, like Ross Poldark, maybe got involved with some smuggling.
Yes, well, I investigated that very sort of doggedly, because I found it hard to believe that a merchant of Penzance whose brother ran the pub he owned and, you know, imported tea and all these other sort of prized goods, did not have some glancing involvement in smuggling. Not that he was a smuggler, and he certainly wasn't a pirate. But smuggling was absolutely endemic in that part of the world, particularly in that era. And I did actually uncover some really incontrovertible business links between Thomas Branwell and some very notorious smugglers who called themselves merchants of Penzance, but the newspaper called them the most notorious smugglers in that part of the kingdom.
Why was it endemic?
Because the French wars were raging. You know, the taxes were off the scale. You know, import and export taxes. Mm-hmm. All that trade with France, which is literally over there from Cornwall, was easier to conduct, and also because the authorities were preoccupied with fighting wars. You know, there was the War of Independence had just happened, hadn't it, or was happening. There was the Napoleonic Wars, which were incredibly draining for a long, long time in England. So, and the Penzance customs men, you'll know if you've read the book, it just makes such comic reading, doesn't it? They were so beleaguered. There were like 3 of them, and said, you know, they're insolent fellows and we dare not approach them. I think, well, if the smugglers don't care, they're just unloading under the noses of the customs. I mean, also, Mounts Bay is a very big area, so a lot of it was going on around the bay. But those records, it's just one after another after another. Even the mayor of Penzance was bound over for smuggling. That's endemic to me.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Okay.
Everyone was doing it. That's the thing. From the aristocracy to the tin mines, everybody's doing it, and they're involved in it, not necessarily in the violent aspects of it that we'd see dramatised, but just the everyday way of bringing in and selling on goods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk about Maria as a reader. You kind of already referred to the book club there in Penzance. Talk about how it worked, but talk about also what kinds of things she liked to read and what effect it might have had on her, and then what effect it would have had on her children.
She's a very big reader, and that's a very big part of the narrative I explore in the book, because we would not be interested in Maria if it wasn't for her daughters, would we? Her incredibly gifted daughters. So yes, I mean, she was an educated woman, and a religious family like hers would have educated the daughters to the same, well, not the same standard probably, but they would be educated women, and possibly and probably they would have taught in Sunday school, in the Wesleyan meetings there. So we know for a fact that she used to read the Methodist magazine, which was full of sensational accounts of conversions or deaths. Quite interesting. She used to read, we have got in the archive the lists from each president of the Penzance Book Club, and around the time when Maria was there, was a young woman who by then had a legacy of her own that she could spend on reading matter. So they were reading novels, they were reading fashion, travel, religion, opinion, and there was certain on the book for 1811, which is a year before she left Penzance, was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And she was both a social and an actual contemporary of Jane Austen, living a very similar life to her. She was of a similar social strata. So I always find that quite interesting. And also she would have been reading the Ladies' Magazine, which is the really exciting stuff. So that would have been, you know, it was pioneering for its time, really. I mean, it gave a platform to women writers. It was fashion. It was comment again, but crucially, it was also where she would read her Gothic fiction. And this was absolutely the peak of Gothic fiction. These pot boilers, you know, shrieks in ghastly corridors and running about, and it always turned out to be, you know, explainable. But we know for a fact that she enjoyed those because Charlotte Bronte, obviously long after Maria had died, said that she used to love them. In a letter she wrote that how much she used to love reading her mother's and her aunt's old ladies' magazines, and that she wished she'd been alive to write for them. When it was, I think she said something like, when it was flourishing like a green bay tree. I mean, she's talking about the time when Maria would have been reading them. So obviously Charlotte, who went on to tell her schoolmates horribly frightening Gothic stories, and also to write The Mad Woman in the Attic in Jane Eyre. I mean, it's a demonstrable link from her mother's reading matter and her aunt's reading matter to her Gothic sensibilities, I think.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, she's got, and there's lots of books, not lots, but, you know, a number of books in the Parsonage collection that have survived. Some that are stained from the shipwreck that they were in, that show that she had a wide variety of reading matter, from poetry to very pious work. She's a very religious woman. So there would be poetry, there would be the magazines, there would be the religious texts. But also, when I was researching her later years when she was married with the children, her best friend used to keep a note of what she read as well. Well, Maria would have been the parson's wife and deferred to, and certainly in that evangelical circle would have shared reading matter and reading taste and reading discussion. So you would have people like Hannah More, who was in the original Blue Stocking Circle. You know, the Blue Stockings of London?
I don't.
No, they're really interesting, actually. They were very usually sort of upper class women who would get together to read and discuss books, and they were very well regarded, and they used to be for both men and women. And Hannah More was part of that circle, but she was also very, very devoted to the evangelical cause, so she would churn out tracts for the poor. And then Maria herself actually wrote a tract that we know of.
So they had one foot in fiction and one foot in religion.
Well, yes. I mean, the stories on these tracts tended to be sort of improving tales or sort of cautionary tales about, and to my eye, my ear, my sensibility, I think they tend to be about the poor versus the undeserving poor. But they're no better or worse than anything else from that kind of genre. I don't think it matters particularly what Maria wrote about. I think it matters that she was writing.
Yeah.
The little Brontes and her husband and her son took it as normal that women wrote. Women wrote with the hope of publication, even though her tract was never published. Patrick kept it.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. She was a woman of letters. She was a lady of letters, and of course, key to that is the actual letters that we have. Her love letters to Patrick from 1812.
And that I'm sure was not lost on her children.
No.
Yeah. Which of the Bronte novels is your favorite, and why?
That's an evil question.
I know, I didn't tell you that one.
Favorite? Do you know, I think it's either Villette by Charlotte, because it's so complicated and bitter. I love it. Or it's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne, because again, that was, I mean, not now, because this is Anne's bicentenary year, and the reappraisal of Anne is well underway. Lots of people have written about what an extraordinary writer she was, and it was pretty much seen now, I think, as possibly one of the first full-length feminist novels. It was very, very shocking at the time that a woman would leave her husband to save herself and her child. You know, and she's quite a prickly person, isn't she? The Huntingdon. She's not sickly sweet. She's not, but she's very strong, and she's driven by this desire to get away from this abusive marriage and to save her son from becoming his father. I I find that very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And also they came from Anne, and nobody could quite believe it, especially Charlotte. I don't know where that came from. I think it was a mistake, she almost said. I think she did so. So, yes, but I love them all. I mean, Wuthering Heights, there's nothing like Wuthering Heights, is there?
No.
Never before or since. And Emily is a fascinating woman, isn't she? Because, to be honest, we know so little about her. So little about Emily Bronte. What's your favourite?
Oh,
Jane Eyre, amazing.
Probably Jane Eyre. I know Alison's favorite is Jane Eyre.
Yeah.
How about you, Marcia?
Probably Wuthering Heights. And I have to
Wuthering
admit, I haven't read all of them by any means.
No.
What about
I mean,
you?
Jane Eyre is extraordinary. I read it again really recently and I'm struck again by...
What I'm struck by is that the men are so complex. You know, these aren't cardboard characters, you know, and I just think I'm struck by that.
I'll tell you what someone said to me once at a book event I did in Southwark Cathedral in London. These people came and there were quite a few men there, and there's a really young chap there who I think was a foreign student who was studying. I think he told me, I can't remember. This other chap was there and he said, I only came because I thought it was interesting. He says, so which book should I read first? And this man said, Wuthering Heights, that's a man's book. That was great. I said, well, yeah, probably. There's no interior monologue, is there, with them, Wuthering Heights? You never know what they're thinking.
That's true. Okay. Do you see any reflection of their mother in any of the characters in their books?
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because just sort of reading Agnes Grey again at the moment, and Agnes Grey's mother, I don't know if you've read it.
No.
No. Well, her mother is...
Which one wrote Agnes Grey?
Agnes Grey, yeah. It's the one that Anne wrote that was published.
Okay.
That was published with Wuthering Heights together. So, of course, Wuthering Heights got most of the attention, and it was like, oh, and Agnes Grey. But in that, Agnes Grey is the governess. Obviously, very, very largely inspired by Anne's own experiences as a governess. But her mother in that is a well-born lady who's married a penniless clergyman. I mean, that does have huge echoes, doesn't it, for Maria and Patrick?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But in that book, her parents disown her, whereas there's no real evidence that Maria's family were unhappy about her marriage. But then her parents were dead by then, so I don't know. Her brother was a bit of a... I mean, he was a mayor and he's very important, but I think he wasn't very good with money, and he obviously, possibly, I don't know, this is the sort of stuff we don't know, maybe was quite happy to see one of his sisters married wherever.
So he didn't have to care for her. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also think that Maria, I just think their yearning for their mother is as important as anything that might surface in their work. And I think the fact that all their characters, virtually, apart from the odd one, are motherless, and that in some way plays into their sensibility and their sense of self, I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah.
They miss their mother, they yearn for their mother, or they feel, that they feel very alone because they don't have a mother.
Can you talk?
Or liberated. I mean, some of them are liberated by not having a mother. So we can all relate to that.
Depending on who are, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you talk a bit more about their second mother, Aunt Elizabeth, what she was like and how she came to be in that situation?
Well, she was done like a kipper, really, wasn't she? Maria was a Bronte for 9 years, and poor Elizabeth was not a Bronte, but in the Bronte parsonage for 20 years, and she died there.
Yeah.
We don't know a great deal about Elizabeth, which I find incredibly vexing, because Charlotte's great friend Ellen Nussey does write about her, but in the quite dismissive way that a younger woman would write about an older woman, I think. She says at one point, oh, she would be forever telling us stories about her younger days where she was quite the belle of Penzance. She seemed to miss them. I thought, nobody wrote these down. You know, it's a whole house full of writers. Nobody's written down. But they probably did come out in their work, and there's been a lot of discussion around that, hasn't there? Mm. But she was very outgoing, and from what we know of that reference to her being a belle of Penzance and a few of her sort of items that survive in the collection, she was obviously quite a big personality, and it was incredibly noble to travel to Yorkshire, to realise that her sister was dying. I mean, she'd been up before to help with the firstborn. To know she was dying, to know that when she did die, Patrick could not cope with those 6 very little children by himself, and that, you know, she was going to have to stay on, really, which she did. And it depends who you listen to as to what she was like, really. She made a real pet of Anne, and Anne was only a baby, so she would have seen her as her mother figure. Yeah. Branwell, the son, interestingly, was very devoted to her. And I think there's a feeling that, you know, she would have made a pet of the only boy, maybe. But again, we don't know that, do we? So she's even more mysterious than Maria in lots of ways. Who was Aunt Branwell? She's either portrayed as this terrible harridan, or, you know, someone who doesn't quite get what's going on, or has to be dodged, I think. But if it wasn't for her legacy, then they wouldn't have had their little first forays into publishing. The money she left them was used in part to publish their poetry, and then later Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, certainly.
Yeah. There's some pictures in the book. But,
it always takes as much effort almost as the writing. I hate getting the plates together.
Yeah, so who's that?
That's her, yes. That is Maria. That's profile. What you say, I think, I don't know. I think they think that was probably originally a pair. But that was then used by Charlotte to, there's another picture, you can find it online, where Charlotte's done a version of that, but she's really prettied her up. And I didn't want to use a prettied up one. I wanted to use that one, because presumably that was closer to what she really looked like.
And then this is her father, Thomas.
Thomas, yes. It's quite a gent, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Gentleman of Penzance, Alderman.
This is her mom, right?
It's Anne Carn. The Carns were a very influential family as well, the Carns and the Branwells.
And then this is Elizabeth. Now, was Elizabeth considered the real pretty one of them?
I don't know, you see, I try not to speculate about that, really. We've only got that picture and these occasional comments by Ellen about these stories she used to tell. I think, I took the view, taken together, she was quite outgoing, and because she was older, she probably took the lead in sort of social occasions. But, I mean, what does pretty even mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
She was always described as elegant, so... Well, Maria was, not Elizabeth particularly, because she was quite an old lady by the time.
This was their home on Chapel Street.
Yes, lovely house. I was very fortunate to be allowed to look around that.
Yeah.
That, I mean, that's very near to the sea. You can't see there, but that goes down to the harbour.
Well, what was one of the habits that Aunt Elizabeth had?
Oh, snuff, yes. I love that picture because, I mean,
look at that picture.
To do it, yeah, because it was a Georgian habit for women. It was a fashionable thing for Georgian women to do. But come the censorious Victorian age, and she clearly did it just to sort of outrage Charlotte's prissy friends, I think. She'd take it out and just, what are you going to do? But even Queen Charlotte used to take snuff. It's a very Georgian pastime for women.
Yeah,
of a certain class.
This is a picture of
Patrick.
Whom she married, and he came from Ireland. Is that right?
Yeah, Northern Ireland is an Ulsterman.
Yeah.
Protestant Irishman.
Now, you referred to a shipwreck. You want to tell them what that was about?
Yes, in one of her letters, she makes reference to a shipwreck. And she's clearly sent for all her things from Penzance, told them she's not coming home. And
You're talking about Elizabeth or Maria?
Mariah, yeah.
Maria, okay.
So it's 1812 when Mariah, it's October, I think, and they got married in December, so it would have been her bottom drawer. We certainly know her wedding veil was in there. And we know some of the books were, because they're water stained, and that's a sort of clue. But yes, she said that, you know, I think she said something like, oh, all my belongings have been claimed by the mighty deep. But I thought that was fascinating. I thought it was a really interesting element, not only of her story, but of that era, to sort of explore that seagoing element of her life. She lived by the sea, her stuff came by sea. So yeah, I investigated that in North Devon, where it happened. And I mean, it's quite a long story. It's all in the book, obviously, how the ship would have wrecked, what the ship was, the story of that ship, who went and rescued her belongings and got them back to her.
So
I found all that fascinating.
She got them back?
She got some of them back, yeah.
Some of them back.
I mean, we know that because of the books, and also Patrick's written at the front, you know, rescued from the deep, my wife's belongings or something. I think it's one of the poetry books.
Okay. I don't know if you wanted to read from your book a portion.
I could, except I was just looking for it without disturbing my dog. I could, but I'd have to go and find it. You got a second? Oh no, I could bring it up on screen actually. What do you want me to read? This is a terrible admission, but I don't have my reading glasses on.
That's okay.
I think, I'm sorry, if I did.
When they first met, or do you want to?
Why don't you read it?
Okay.
Let me see if I can put it in a large enough font. I possibly can. What do you want me to read?
How about page 73? No, let's 72, the bottom of 72, I think. Where it starts ostensibly. There's a kind of a page, small break, and then, do you want me to just read?
Ostensibly.
Ostensibly.
Sure if that's a paperback, I might not have the same page numbers.
Ah.
I could look for ostensibly though, that's not impossible. Let's try that. Oh, ostensibly the Reverend Patrick Bronte, that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I can read that. Let me, in grannified fashion, make it really huge because I don't have my glasses on. Right. Ostensibly, the Reverend Patrick Bronte was there to double check on what was expected of him as the school's external classics examiner. In truth, he had walked a dozen miles across country, at least in part, to meet the much talked of Miss Branwell. Jane and William engineered the meeting of their eligible best friends to give Cupid a nudge. It was a blind date, or at least a blind pot of tea. As William and Jane teased each other about wedding plans, Maria would make a witty aside, and they would all talk of books, of religion, of life. Of course, what everyone noticed and nobody mentioned, at least not until later, was the instant chemistry between the Irish curate and the Cornish cousin. Is that okay?
Yeah.
It's quite a feat with these glasses. That was all at Woodhouse Grove, which is the school where they met. And they're really interested in this at school. They're really nice people. It's their history as well. The school was founded the year that they met.
It's no longer standing, is it?
Oh, it is, yeah.
But it's not
successful, well-regarded school. Yeah, it's still going. Woodhouse Grove.
It's going as a school. Oh, yeah. For boys? or for both?
No, it's for both. It's a private school, and it's still got Wesleyan connections, Methodist connections. Yeah.
So she didn't, she went there ostensibly to help with caring for all these boys, right?
Yeah. You open a free boarding school and you're very quickly overrun, aren't you?
Yes. And her poor 60-year-old.
Yeah, poor Aunt Jane, who was knocking 60, right? It's all too much for her. They used to call her the Duchess. She used to wear this hat, and I sort of always imagined as this sort of dishevelled figure. But
Shortly,
it was a very chaotic time. They were good people, but they weren't. It was chaotic, and they had all these boys. It was for the sons of itinerant preachers. It was for Wesley's itinerant preachers, and it was really to bring up a new generation of preachers, because the nonconformists were doing so well in that industrialized era that I suppose it was a manpower problem, really. So had them all there.
Yeah,
but it was also a converted Georgian mansion, so it's a very lovely place, and she would have inhabited really the sort of governor's quarters. A companion to her cousin Jane, who she'd grown up with partly in Cornwall, and a help to her aunt and uncle, the Fennels, who ran.
Really, she didn't have to work there very long, did she?
Well, no, because she met Patrick, and it was a whirlwind romance, and she was married by Christmas.
Yeah, and so then is that why Aunt Jane and them decided to give up running that place?
No, it's quite a complicated story, really. That was when really the Methodists were going it alone from the Church of England, and if you were an evangelical Christian of the time, but a Wesleyan, you had to choose a side, really. Were you going to stay with the established church, or were you going to go with the Methodists? And they all stayed with the Church of England.
Because
Fennel became a minister as well.
Were the social ramifications too difficult if you went with the Wesleyan, the Methodist?
I don't think so. I'm not an expert in that area, but it was a big deal, the fact that they were breaking off, because John Wesley himself always wanted to reform from within, so the fact that after his death they did take that path.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it became quite a different organisation than it maybe had been in its earlier days, but I'm absolutely not the expert on that. But Patrick Brontë never was a Wesleyan. He was always a Church of England clergyman with evangelical sympathies. So they all continued within that tradition, within the C of E.
So when she married him, she just kind of went that way.
Because we have an established church here. You probably know that.
Church of England, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a queen, and then, it's Patrick Brontë somewhere here.
Well, Marcia or Louise, do you have any questions you want to ask?
I noticed Sharon's also a playwright, and I'm wondering, which do you enjoy more, writing books or plays?
It's a good question. I enjoy them both. If I'm writing, I'm happy, really, because I can't do anything else. I'm always saying I can't cook, can't paint, can't speak a language. I do enjoy writing plays because I know I'll probably never write a novel. So that is my fictional part of my writing. But the plays are not, although we've produced them and we've got good results and we've had professional actors, they've never taken that professional leap, really. Whereas my books are my profession. My books are my journalism, and I always see my books as just an extension of my journalism, because they're true life stories, things that happen to people, especially forgotten people, especially forgotten women. But I do want to write more plays, actually, and I've started writing one. I started writing two, actually, during lockdown. I was so bored. One, yeah. I won't say what they are yet, because I think that kind of kills it in your head, doesn't it? But yeah, I've got two.
Oh, good.
And I'd like to write a screenplay. I'd like to write.
And I also noticed your first book has a very interesting title, Balloonomania Bells. Where does that come from?
Well, that was what they called the craze for balloons from the 1783 onwards. It was called balloonomania. It was like this fashion.
Hot air balloons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hot air balloons. The Montgolfiers invented them in France in 1783. And then people couldn't get enough of them. They used to wear them on the head, hats, they used to have it on the curtains, you know, they used to have little pins. And balloonomania was what it was called. It's also called balloon influenza, balloon fever, all these things. People were so excited by it. We can't comprehend it. Nobody, the biggest crowds that had ever been seen on planet Earth were the ones that gathered for the first balloon ascents. It was astonishing that people could fly. And this idea, but then nobody, when I started researching it, seemed to realise, apart from Sophie Blanchard, that women were in the act right from the beginning, and not just one or two women, loads of women, and they all have just hilarious or tragic or astonishing.
When you say in the act, you mean writing in them or making them?
Being aeronauts, being aeronauts.
Aeronauts. Okay.
There's a whole chapter on the American aeronauts, actually, who were a fascinating bunch as well. So it's all in there if you're interested.
So, Frilla, was that the name of the play?
Yes, I called it that because it was a ghost story, and also Lily used to wear frilly bloomers. That was quite scandalous, but very practical, really. So she'd take off her skirt before she get into the balloon and set off, and it was like an Edwardian, showgirl trick. And I like a pun, so it made me laugh.
I'm wondering what inspired you to write this book, and if you would tell us a little bit about your research process.
To write Mrs. Bronte.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm from Bradford. The Brontes are Bradford born. They live in they're still districts of Bradford, are Thornton and Haworth, where the Bronte parsonage is. And I grew up with the Brontes sort of in the air, but not really knowing enough about them, and certainly not studying them at school, which is very different now. They absolutely are on the curriculum. So I was a local reporter on a local paper. I started my career that covered Haworth. So I always covered it as an observer, whatever was going on at the parsonage. And it's only when I moved away to the West Country myself, so I did that reverse journey in my 20s, and came home a lot, because I go home to Yorkshire a lot, even though I live in London through a series of events. I married a Londoner, basically. That I just became really fascinated by the Brontes properly as an adult and as a sort of writer myself. And then I became a bit obsessed with their mother, thinking, where's their mother in all this? 200 years. And even at the parsonage, she's called a shadowy figure on the boards. And it just fascinated me, and I thought, I can't believe that no one's ever written a biography of her. I can't believe there isn't enough to write that book. So I just went off to find out, really. And it was an absolutely fascinating research journey that took me all around England and through the archives to Ireland. And it's fascinating, and I met some interesting people, and it's lovely. Doing things like this, people are fascinated. It's like, the minute you say Mrs. Bronte, it's like, oh yeah, where is she? We all know about Patrick, the father of genius, but the mother of genius. There's no genetic component to any sort of literary geniuses to compare to the Bronte sisters, is there? So they were half Maria. And I do think they were their mother's daughters, for all the reasons I talk about in the book.
So what you won't talk about your ideas for plays. Are you working on another nonfiction book?
I am, but again, that's sort of under wraps at the moment until we can make it official. But what I can say is that I'm updating and revising The Balloonist, and that's coming out next year as a paperback, and that'll be called The Lost History of the Lady Aeronauts, which is much more explanatory and a lot less of a mouthful than many about. So I'm looking forward to doing that, actually, because those stories are extraordinary. I love The Balloonist.
Have you ever been up in one?
Oh, no, people always ask me that, and I always say no, but then neither did the Montgolfiers. Although one of them did go up once and frightened himself and never went up again. I would have got, I mean, what I don't often say is that As a journalist, I've written too many horror stories, really, because you're only writing about it for a paper if something awful's happened, don't you? Because of power lines. I would have gone up then when there was no danger in the sky. I think I probably will go one day. Have you ever been up?
Not in a hot air balloon, no. But we have them around here sometimes.
That's on my bucket.
What?
I say going up in a balloon is on my bucket list.
Is
Really?
it?
Yeah. I will do it, I think, just because I'm always surprised that no one's really pressed me, because I think, if they really pressed me, I can't really ignore them. But no one has. I do know lots of balloonists who are always offering. And actually, when I came to America a couple of years ago, I went to Philadelphia, where the first balloon, Pierre Blanchard made the first balloon flight, but also by someone called Madame Johnson, who I'm astonished she's not a bigger deal in America. She was the first woman to fly in America. She flew from the Battery in New York. Then she went to Philadelphia. But yeah, I met Bob Sparks, who is a really respected and famous and accomplished balloonist there. And he's such a nice man. And we had a hilarious day running around Philadelphia. He kept grabbing my arm and saying, run like the wind, whenever we were crossing the road.
Run like the wind.
He's lovely, a lovely man. And he's made the replica of the Montgolfier balloon that's in the Smithsonian. So I did see that. He hadn't mentioned it when I was with him, and I was looking at it and I said, Bob, did you make that? I went, oh yeah. I think he's done so many cool things, he just didn't mention it. But I'd love to have some kind of recognition of Madame Johnson, because she caused a riot on Broadway as well. That was quite a story.
Well,
if your balloon didn't go up and people have been drinking, they just riot for something to do.
Well,
I've got 2 other books in the offing, but I can't talk about them for various reasons, really. But yes.
Okay, get in touch with me when you can.
I will.
Okay.
Are people very interested in the Brontes there?
Huh?
Are you very interested in the Brontes in Utah or in America?
Well, yeah. I think they're more interested in Jane Austen, to be honest. But there's a lot of Austen fanatics in Utah.
Okay. Well, that is, to be honest, that's why I do put Jane Austen in quite often, to say, if you're interested in Jane Austen, then you're interested in this because it's her era.
Yeah.
Alison, you're a Bronte fan there.
Well, I tried reading Wuthering Heights and I couldn't get through it, but I love Jane Eyre. And I was just looking up The Tenant of Wilfield. I think I want to read that one. That looks really interesting too. Yeah, I've read Jane Eyre several times. It's my favorite novel. I was 12 when I read it for the first time. So I need to just read more. I have 2 little kids and finding time to read.
I won't read for about 20 years then.
Yeah.
Have you seen To Walk Invisible? It's a drama by Sally Wainwright. The BBC did it with HBO. It's really good, and it's very exciting because I was in Yorkshire when they rebuilt on the top of Penistone Moor. They rebuilt the parsonage and the original church, because the church there now is not the one that was Mr. Bronte's church.
Oh.
They just built the whole thing and filmed it. It was amazing. And bits of furniture that the BBC couldn't store, they gave to sort of significant places that were associated with
this was a documentary.
I have had pictures of me on the copy of the chaise longue that poor Emily died on. What you do? You watch that. I'm sure you'll find it. I'm sure that's gettable.
To Walk Invisible.
To Walk Invisible.
Have any of you heard of that?
Said. Yeah.
I haven't heard of that.
No. If you look for it, it's probably on YouTube or something. I don't know.
Okay.
Or legit. I'm sure you can find it legit somewhere. It's very good. Sally Wainwright is an amazing writer. She's a British writer. She writes astonishing, fabulous television.
Well,
I wake up, so I might have to go.
Yeah, thank you.
So nice to meet you.
Sharing your time.
If you read the book, let me know what you think.
Yes, I want to. So I'll probably
Yay,
do it.
Sharon. Yay, Sharon.
I believe we're ready to conclude.
Yes. It's been lovely to meet you anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, remember you can buy or order the book from using the link that's in the chat. room. And think about joining us next week at Saturday at 1 for our event with Zohar Saeed, author of Pure Land,
All right.
a novel of magical realism inspired by the life of Pakistan's only Nobel Prize-winning physicist. So I'm going to wish you goodbye, Sharon.
Well, thank you. Goodbye.
And all of you. And
Thank you, Tanya, for
Yes.
giving us this opportunity.
you're welcome.
Yeah.
Have a good day, all of you. Stay safe and stay well.
Yeah.
And
You too.
stay in touch, Sharon, when you're ready to talk about your next book, okay?
I will.
Okay.
Lovely to meet you. Take care.
You too. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.